Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are taking a look at the Mosin Nagant, but specifically the Mosin Nagant as reused, adapted and reused by the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I. So the Austro-Hungarians, of course, captured a tremendous number of Mosin Nagant rifles while fighting against the Russians. And as early as November of 1914, they officially made the decision that they were going to rechamber them for the Austrian 8x50mm Mannlicher cartridge and put them back into service. Now, these weren't ever used by frontline troops. They were for, rear echelon guards, supply, all the second line troops who are very unlikely to ever actually shoot their rifles, but they need to have some sort of weapon. So we'll take our standard M95 rifles, the best guns that we have, send them to the frontline troops, and use captured, rechambered enemy equipment for supporting the logistics in the rear areas. Now, this work was done by a whole bunch of different companies. So the biggest of them was Steyr, OEWG. Their conversions are usually, but not always, marked with an OEWG logo. The main Austrian artillery workshop also did them. They stamped the rifles AZF. So if you see an AZF stamp, that is an Austrian 8x50 rechambering of a Mosin. There were then 4 separate private shops located throughout Austria that were contracted to do this work in much smaller numbers, but they also did them. And then the imperial government also directed the Budapest arsenal to make these conversions, although it appears they did very few. So to put the numbers in context, in total, several hundred thousand of these guns were rechambered for 8x50. We know from at least one piece of recorded documentation that as of August 1916, Budapest had converted like 2,100 and change. Steyr had converted more than 123,000 of them. So I think these are way more common than people recognize. And the other thing that people don't recognize is that they are rechambered rifles. They are not rebored rifles. These are 7.62 bores with 8x50 chambers. Let's take a closer look and let me explain what was going on with that. Usually, you would find a marking from the shop or factory or company that did the conversion here on the chamber or on the receiver, OEWG or AZF, or one of the private company marks. By the way, those would be JSE or R or WWF or an actual little logo of a bear. Now, this particular rifle and many others don't have that marking. So the next thing that you would look at that would distinguish an Austrian rechamber is the rear sight. The markings on the side have been scrubbed off and replaced with schritt. This is an Austrian measurement, essentially the length of one pace, not that much different than the Soviet or the Russian arshins, but they've recalibrated the sight for 2, 3, 4, 5, and 600 schritt. According to the documentation that was also joined by a new Austrian front sight, this one looks an awful lot like a Russian front sight, but it might be subtly different in height. I'm honestly not sure. The original instructions for the conversion also talked about recutting the rifling out to 8mm in diameter to properly fit the 8x50 Mannlicher cartridge, but they appear to have virtually never done that because they discovered they could cut a new chamber for 8x50, leave the bore alone, and the rifles would actually work basically just fine. Yeah, you are compressing the bullet down about 0.4 millimeters. And yes, that does result in higher pressures, but it's less than proof loads, and these rifles were not expected to actually be fired very much. They weren't going to frontline combat units. And so that was just sort of accepted as a tolerable practice. For those of you who might be shocked at that decision, and it certainly is surprising in today's context, I would also point out there were a number of black powder rifles that were converted to smokeless cartridges during World War I for this same sort of use. The Italians, of course, converted Vetterlis to 6.5 Carcano. Those, by the way, I would consider pretty unsafe, and I would not shoot today with 6.5 Carcano. The French also converted Gras to 8mm Lebel, which is also, I think that's maybe a little bit less unsafe, but still not a great idea to go out there and shoot. So, at any rate, the The Austro-Hungarians did this conversion to both full-length Mosin Nagant rifles as well as Dragoon and Cossack rifles, the slightly shortened versions, and they even cut some of these down to like 1907, or rather M95 cavalry carbine length, although those are really quite scarce. They did also convert the sling attachments to the Austro-Hungarian pattern, so they've added a sling swivel to the butt of this rifle and just a plain through hole for a wire sling hanger up here on the front. It's kind of interesting, there was actually some Austrian documentation where they were considering converting these to 7.65 by 53mm Mauser. That's like the Belgian Mauser cartridge. The idea being, well, then your bore diameter would be essentially just fine to begin with. But then they came to the conclusion that squeeze boring down to 7.62 from an 8mm, or down to 8mm down to 7.62 was actually not really a feasible practical problem. And of course they didn't actually have any Belgian Mauser ammo around, so wasn't worth doing, and they never followed through on that plan at all. But it is interesting that it's something they specifically did give some thought to. Now, the Austro-Hungarian army did also reuse captured Mosin Nagants in 7.62 by 54, but they only did so when they had access to captured ammunition, because Austria and Hungary never actually produced Russian caliber ammunition during World War I. What they did produce, though, were stripper clips for the Mosin Nagant to use 8x50 rimmed. There was a company that was contracted to make, I think, over 1 million of those stripper clips so that they could issue ammunition for these rifles. By the way, I would love to find one of those stripper clips. I've never seen one in person. I don't know how you can distinguish them, but that'd be a really cool, weird piece of gun accessory. They also manufactured bayonets. Just essentially a copy of the Russian spike bayonet, but apparently the Austro-Hungarian forces didn't capture as many bayonets as they did rifles, and they wanted to supplement them, which I suppose does actually make some sense, because this is a somewhat sketchy system for firing, because you are just squeeze boring the 8mm bullets down to 7.6 every time you fire, and they're rear echelon troops, prisoner guards, road guards, factory guards, that sort of thing, where the bayonet can be a more useful weapon of persuasion, perhaps, than actually shooting. So anyway, the Austro-Hungarians did manufacture new bayonets, but they're functional copies of the Russian spike bayonet. Now, after World War II, these rifles continue to survive. They're not as rare today as you might think, although they're rarely in original Austro-Hungarian form. So what happened with a lot of them is they were used as war reparations from Austria-Hungary to Italy. War goods as war reparations were a pretty common thing. The French army, for example, trained with German Maxims in 8mm Mauser for years and years and years and years after World War I, because they got a tremendous amount of that material as reparations at the end of the war. Well, Austria-Hungary did the same thing, provided tens of thousands of Mosin Nagants to Italy, and those were predominantly captured rechambered ones like this. Now, Italy didn't have a whole lot that they could do with Mosin Nagants, and so in the 1920s, they sold tens of thousands of them to the Finns, who were looking for Mosin Nagants and parts anywhere they could find them in Europe. So a lot of these guns, at least in pieces and parts, survive today in the form of Finnish M27s, Finnish M28s, potentially Finnish M39s as well, and you can recognize them by both the conversion marks, the AZF and OEWG chamber conversion marks, as well as the rear sights remarked into schritt. So hopefully you guys enjoyed some of this background on sort of a side trail that the Mosin Nagant took during World War I. Thanks for watching.